Alexander Tuschinski, we spoke 6 years ago after the production of Mission Caligula. We talked a little bit after that movie came out, so there were some things that had happened between when the movie was released and when we actually spoke. But 6 years, what happened right after? Can you tell me a little bit of what the post of Mission Caligula was?
When Mission Caligula came out, that was quite an intense time for me. I had just discovered a lot of material in the Penthouse archive in the prior years. In the film, I presented the project to reconstruct Tinto Brass' edit of Caligula in his style and with his participation, if he likes. So that was a big condition for me that Tinto Brass participates. In the Penthouse archive, I had discovered Tinto Brass' workprint of the film, which essentially goes until the scene in which Macro gets killed with this huge killing machine. And my idea was to finish that workprint together with Tinto, if possible. And there was a lot of excitement. After that episode, I decided to upload Mission Caligula on YouTube and Vimeo with the permission of the rights holders, which was a good idea in retrospective because I see a lot of people have watched it. However, the project didn't come to pass. There was a change in ownership with Penthouse, and basically the project to reconstruct Tinto's workprint didn't happen. That's what I can say. And that's 2018, 2019. And since then, I've done my own films. I've done quite a lot of things since then, but I guess we're talking about the Caligula-related things. In the immediate aftermath, I did two independent films, Gas-Shaped Light and Fetzenleben, which are somewhat more serious and somewhat more dark than my usual films. And I did this because my mood wasn't the best at that time. And I'm very proud of these films. I'm happy how they turned out. But that's what happened in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah, I had heard that Penthouse had gone through new ownership and that Kelly Holland was no longer CEO. What do you know about that? Because I had heard Pornhub bought them out, but I don't know if that's just shorthand for something else.
First of all, I can say I got along with her very well. And as you can see in Mission Caligula, she really wanted to make this possible for Tinto Brass to edit the film, again, the way he likes. Then there was a change in ownership. She lost ownership of the company. In one period, she was there, I was talking to her, and then there were other people, basically. And I told them who I was, what my ideas are, what the project is. But as I said, ultimately, it didn't happen. To me, it was honestly a bit surprising when suddenly this other project was brought up. And at first I thought, it's related to what I want to do. I remember I had a few discussions back in 2019 where I made clear I'm only interested to participate in a project where I had two conditions. The first condition is that I'm in charge of digitizing the footage. I had a lot of conversations already when discovering the footage and so on with labs, how to do it. My degrees, I'm a Bachelor of Engineering in Audiovisual Media, so I know about that side. And the footage was in a lot of boxes with a sorting that was not that intuitive, but I did know it quite well after a lot of research. So I thought I have to be in charge of the digitizing to make sure that everything is digitized. Some parts of the film survived in 35mm negative, some in positive, some in 16mm. And the second condition was that there is no outside interference on the editing and that Tinto Brass has to be approached. And if possible, he has to participate. My big dream was Tinto Brass turned 90 last year. And I remember I had the big dream for Tinto Brass's 90th birthday to release a film that finally says directed by Tinto Brass in the credits. And if Tinto Brass would have said no, my idea was I would reconstruct the workprint. So I have the first half of the film approximately. I would reconstruct the second half based on my research in a style that I feel is very appropriate to his, and then release that as a reconstruction, as a completed reconstructed workprint. Be very honest about what it is. It was very important for me to try to get Tinto to participate.
How would you describe Tinto Brass's style? You've said before on the show that he was very influential to your filmmaking. And I'm curious, how would you define that kind of either editing style or shooting style? Like, what makes a Tinto Brass film a Tinto Brass film?
In preparation for this conversation, I did look up my old notes, and I found my first notes about the editing of Caligula are from 2007, when I was 18 years old. This is a long time, and Tinto Brass's editing style has been very influential for me. I think if people want to really get an idea of his style, there's a lot of 1960s films he did, or the film Salon Kitty. I think a friend of mine described it as impressionist once, and I do agree. There is a lot of quick cuts. To me, it flows very naturally. There is zooms in it that I think today are not that usual in the visual language of most filmmakers, but they are masterfully done. And it's basically these quick edits that form an impression of the scene. I would say very playful. That's a word that I could use. I think there is two films to watch. One is called Col Cuore in Gola, in English Deadly Sweet, from the 60s, where he went to London doing a low-budget thriller crime film, where he's just so playful with the camera. The story is very simple, but the style is elaborate. And then there's the film Salon Kitty, which he did right before Caligula, where he had a bigger budget. And when I first watched Tinto Brass's films, I was so impressed by the style because I thought that's the style of visuals that I like. I could say I didn't model my visual style after his. It was more, I had those ideas and I found him, and that became something I really appreciated. And so when I started doing films, I was very influenced also to use zooms, to use quick cuts. And my own editing style has been sometimes described to be reminiscent of his. So I would say these quick, unexpected cuts, interesting camera angles, and an overall flow. Also, the soundtrack often flows very well with the visual. When I think of Salon Kitty, there is a sequence where a song is played on the morning after, which kind of reminds me of the film Cabaret a bit. And then you can just see how one pan leads to the next pan, and that leads to a zoom, and it all moves very naturally. When I looked at the raw footage for Caligula, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in the topic, but when I looked at the raw footage for Caligula in the archive, I got to say I was hard to look at it and not be able to edit it immediately, because Tinto filmed from multiple cameras. I personally have used 2 cameras in some films. He sometimes used more than that. And you can see they cover a scene from various angles. There's a lot of footage that was never intended to be seen. That's just one camera adjusting or so. You have a lot of zooms that look not very well, but then you have zooms that look really good. And those were the ones that were supposed to go in the film. You can see that I admire that style very much. And I would say there's one film, The Key, that Tinto did in the early 80s, that also still preserves this style. He has the style even in his later films, but I would say until The Key, those films really have the most distinct version of his visual style.
I know it must not be a very pleasant thing to revisit, but I do want to take you back. Are you moved off of the project, or are you just told you're not going to be a part of this? How does that actually go down for you?
As basically, I made my 2 conditions clear. I want to be the one overlooking the digitization to know where everything goes. And the editing has to happen without outside interference. When I said this was it, I was not involved in it. I made clear I don't want to be involved in anything that doesn't reconstruct Tinto Brass vision. It was a very difficult time, I got to say. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant, though I did a lot of creative things for myself, so I thought something has come out of it. I didn't do nothing, I did do some of my own films, which makes me very happy. But over the years, I never really wanted to talk about this at all. And when you contacted me, I contemplated, but I recalled our conversations and I thought, okay, I'll open up about this, but it's still not easy. I can tell you a moving memory that I don't know if I've told people, but it was a very positive memory, actually. When I went to Penthouse in LA in 2016 to look at the archive, and when I discovered the Workprint, which was a video copy of a 16 millimeter print that had been cut into thousands of pieces. I explained that in the Mission Caligula episode. And then I went to Italy to show it to Tinto. And it was, I would say, one of the most moving moments I had when, since the 70s, for the first time, he was able to actually watch his edit. And I was astonished how well he remembered it. That basically, we watch a scene and he finishes a line while it is spoken in the film and so on. I think he hadn't rewatched Caligula for a long time. The edition that had come out, the theatrical edition, has nothing to do with what he wanted. And at that moment, I was so optimistic we could do something. I can tell you my technical proposal I had back then. Because Tinto is born in 33, he's now, I think he's 91 already, how the time passes. So I thought to reconstruct this film. The Workprint was in black and white, but a lot of the color footage still exists. Most of it as negative film, but as far as I was able to see, but I wasn't able to see all the boxes, not all the negatives survived. But there was also positive film, 35mm, and some 16mm reductions for the making of documentary they had done in the 70s. So I wanted to scan everything, positive, negative, 16mm. This would have been a major part of the restoration, to then find out which is the best footage for each individual shot. Then take the 16mm black and white Workprint that I had a video copy of and reconstruct that in color. And then my idea was, I would do a preliminary assembly of the rest of the film in the way that I feel Tinto would like, because it's such a technical process going through the different materials, and then visiting him for as long as it takes, for a few hours per day, to sit there with him. He can say any changes, he can say anything should be different, and so on, with hard drives of all the footage until the film is done. And I always had the feeling, if we get to do it that way, he would be the hero, obviously. It would be his film coming out. I would be an assistant editor, and those in the know would know what I had done. But I would have been really happy about that, I got to say. So that was my hope. And Tinto is still around. But I think what happened really wasn't easy for any of us, let's put it that way.
I'm surprised that Tinto is even able to speak these days, because I just read how demented he is in every article about this new cut that's come out. That's the new producer of the Ultimate Cut, Thomas Nagovin.
Oh, what does he base it off? Has he met Tinto?
He bases it off of a documentary from 2013 called Is Tinto Brass?
And he says the documentary would claim that Tinto has mental problems?
Yeah, I've read that time and again, at least 4 or 5 sources.
I was present when Is Tinto Brass had its world premiere at Venice Film Festival in 2013. Tinto told me about it, and then I got an invite, and I watched Is Tinto Brass sitting in Venice at the film festival, sitting right behind Tinto. And Tinto was happy, and I was also invited to the after parties. Tinto would talk to people, approached him. It was actually quite a funny experience, because sometimes people thought I didn't know Tinto, and they tried to introduce Tinto. Said, "Oh, why are you trying to introduce to me? We know each other." To me, this is a very bizarre claim. Is Tinto Brass that I watched in 2013 at the Venice Film Festival makes no such claim. Tinto talks about his life, talks about all these things. He was sitting right in front of me. I was sitting in the row behind him. Then at the party, people talked to him. Maybe they changed the film after the world premiere, but I doubt it. And I got to say, when I talked to Tinto, when we talked about his films and all that, his memory was so good. And I remember when I first met with him, it was, I believe, 2012. And I was so excited. I showed him some papers I had written about his film Nero su Bianco, and I showed him the Caligula thesis. And we talked about so many things. And then there was this retrospective of his works that happened at an independent film festival in Hollywood, where I actually had the idea and told the festival people, hey, wouldn't it be an idea to approach Tinto? So I had a lot to do with him. his memory was so good when we talked about the workprint of Caligula. I was amazed how he was able to finish the lines that are spoken. He gradually got more excited about this as it went on. And there's a person approaching the scene, and right before the person is approaching, he would say, "Oh, now this one is coming in," and so on. And he was happy to see the edits again, and so on. Honestly, I wouldn't go around making any claims about a man's mental health based on, I don't even know what it's based on. So the film I saw didn't make any claim in that way. If it would have made such claims, Tinto would have reacted, who was sitting there. And I remember he was welcomed as the maestro of cinema at Venice Film Festival. And to me, it was so excited to be a guest there at the screening. And those were good days. I mean, I had a lot of conversations with Tinto over the years about Caligula in various levels of detail. I also did some unpublished interviews with Tinto. I did one on camera, which could have been published at some later point or so. I would say Tinto has always been very clear when speaking about his films, when speaking about his art. I'm not in a position to judge anybody's mental capacities. As a visitor and friend, I went there and nothing weird occurred to me. He was just a kind, old gentleman who loved talking about the films he had done and who took interest in what I'm doing. Just a nice man. I didn't notice anything. So to me, this is all very bizarre to claim otherwise.
Yeah, it sounds like he was very excited by the idea of finally being able to revisit Caligula and be able to make this the project that he wanted.
When I was 18, I felt so intense about this. I still feel intense about it, though over the years I tried not to think so much about it. But basically, I thought with Salon Kitty, Tinto had a bigger budget and he was able to use his cinematic language. With Caligula, he had an even bigger budget and even more sets and more actors who were internationally famous. What kind of film he could have done there with his style, with his editing. So I got very excited from 2007. Then I wrote my thesis at Stuttgart Media University, Hochschule der Medien, in 2011, my bachelor thesis. I updated it over the years, and on the internet there is a most recent version, which is a few years afterwards. Then I got in contact with Tinto. I met one of his friends at an LA film festival, and he put me in touch. I gave Tinto a call. I was so nervous. And we met in Rome. It was beautiful. And we talked about his 60s and 70s films. He did a film called Dropout and one called La Vacanza, which I had never seen, which I wanted to prepare for the festival in LA, which he was very happy to do. And gradually I brought up the Caligula topic. There is a documentary around the time that the Imperial Edition DVD box set was done in 2007. I remember I was excited of getting it and underwhelmed when I watched it because it was still largely the same cut, though the pieces of the workprint there were interesting. And on that documentary called, I believe, The Orgy of Power, Tinto is saying that he really has no interest in revisiting Caligula. And that was his stance for a long time. So when I first brought it up, he was skeptical, and understandably. Then I showed him a reconstruction I had done, I had attempted with the footage available at that point, which got him more positive about it. And I did an interview with him that was shown on the internet and people got excited already in 2013, I believe, where he said, if he can get access to the entire footage, it has to be done. It has to be, I think he used even these words, it has to be done, something like that. And though it is a very delicate topic, of course. And then when I got in contact with Kelly Holland, which was, I would say, a big coincidence. I got in contact with her shortly after she had acquired Penthouse, and she was so open to this project. She allowed me to go into the archive to actually see what they have. And in Mission Caligula, we see how it goes, because I went to Penthouse in 2016, and I was given a box with a few videotapes, basically saying, look, this is the material we have about Caligula. Some hard distant videotapes, which are basically the masters for the Imperial Edition DVD box set. And then calling around a few people and so on. It was quite exciting. We were able to locate the warehouse where the entire raw footage was stored. Boxes upon boxes. Mission Caligula, you can see the pictures I took on those days. It was such excitement. It felt like Christmas and birthday and all kind of celebrations in one. And there's, for example, the Russ Lloyd cut of the film, which is not of such great interest to me personally because I want to reconstruct Tinto's vision. But for example, when Tinto started editing, Russ Lloyd and the team apparently started editing the film parallel to his, which he actually wasn't okay with, from my knowledge. And when Tinto wasn't able to continue editing, Russ Lloyd finished his Russ Lloyd cut. But then the producers in the 70s didn't like that cut and shelved it and had Nino Baragli, I believe, come in to do some more editing. And there were just cans with the Russ Lloyd cuts in black and white, 35mm film. I was thinking, if I did this film, if we succeed with this project, we would include so much bonus feature. It would be the reconstructed, hopefully the director's cut. If Tinto would participate and he has the last word in editing, we'll do Tinto Brass's director's cut on one disc. Another disc will be the Russ Lloyd cut, just for completionists, and completely unknown edit of the film. I found the silent 35mm black and white footage for the Russ Lloyd cut. The audio must have been somewhere else. Basically, these boxes were packed, and I would say if you looked at them as an outsider, it wouldn't make so much sense. But if you knew the production history, it started to make sense to me. These boxes were packed chronologically. They first packed the footage that they were done with at this point and so on. That was the impression I got. So I thought we'll do the Tinto Brass cut, hopefully, if he participates. Then we do the Russ Lloyd cut as a bonus feature. Then we might do the 1980 R-rated cut. Was it 80 or 81, 82, 83? So I had the idea to do all these things to add so much bonus material. There's always been these rumors about a longer cut of Caligula's screening in Cannes. I'm not an expert on those rumors because, as I said, I was mostly interested in the production of the film, not in the post-production that happened when Tinto couldn't continue. But I believe there might be the footage that was cut out of the Cannes version. To my knowledge, though I never confirmed, the impression was that at the trade fair in Cannes, they did show a longer version of the film, which included more hardcore pornography Bob Guccione shot after the fact. So, from my understanding, it would be basically the regular theatrical version plus more pornography. But I didn't get to watch that. An exciting and at the same time somewhat frustrating experience, because when you handle 35mm film, you have to have specialized machines to even view it. And I only had access to such machines briefly, so I was able to unspool some rolls for a foot or two and look at the pictures, get an impression what's on it. Then I was able to watch a few reels, which was really interesting. I'm now combining multiple visits to the archive.
Just the process of film preservation is so interesting, especially when you think about things like the audio, and that you have so many things around audio. You've got the production audio, you've got the ADR recordings, you've got sound effects, music. The music in the version of Caligula that we've seen is so different than what I'm sure that Tinto Brass wanted. And just to be able to bring back that score would have been a real triumph.
When Tinto was in the midst of editing Caligula, Fiorenzo Carpi, the composer, was assigned as the composer for the film. And Fiorenzo Carpi had done music for other films of Tinto already, for example, Salon Kitty. When you watch Salon Kitty, a lot of the soundtrack, the film is set in the late 30s, early 40s, and the soundtrack sounds so period correct. For a long time, I tried to find a waltz from Salon Kitty until I realized it's an original composition for the movie. By now, the soundtrack has been released. And from my understanding, when Tinto did the film, there were some temporary soundtracks in place already. I was able to locate them also, which just gave the rhythm for some scenes that had choreographies in them. And then the final soundtrack would have largely been done after the film is edited. That's why I thought I want to have control over scanning and digitizing this archive, because it was such a complex combination. Of course, we have the final film with the final sound mix as it stands, where you hear voices and music and everything together. Then we have the individual redubbing reels. I remember a lot of them were not in the best condition. They are full coat 35mm magnetic film, basically like a cassette tape, just 35mm wide with perforation. They gave off very vinegary odor, which is a sign that they're decomposing. But those can usually be played back one more time if you bake them at a high heat. So the idea was to also digitize the entire audio and the onset audio as well. Though in a lot of Tinto Brass's films and Italian films of the 70s, the onset audio wasn't recorded with the same care you would record it these days, because oftentimes it was expected that the film would be redubbed, and it's mostly just a temporary track to have a reference. But the idea was to digitize the onset audio, the post-dubbing audio, and so on, assemble the film in the reconstruction I assembled to show to a few people back then with the permission of the rights holders. I used some parts of Bruno Nicolai's score for the final film, and just some parts I felt are more appropriate, just as a temporary placeholder. When we watch the theatrical cut of Caligula, it starts off with Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, with this very grand classical music that wasn't supposed how the film starts at all. I was able to reconstruct the opening. It starts with a blurry frame of Caligula's face. You have the credits underneath, and it's very quiet, just a little bit of soundtrack underneath it. And then suddenly it goes in focus and Caligula wakes up from the nightmare. So that's the opening of the film, for example, and that sets off a very different tone. And I remember when I talked about doing this project, coming from a technical background also, I was very much thinking, how do we approach this? I had the hope that for a lot of the actors, we would be able to use their redubbed lines, Peter O'Toole, for example, Sir John Gielgud, and so on. They came back after the film was edited for its theatrical version to redo their lines, to have very clear deliveries of them. But some of their lines were not redubbed because the theatrical cut got rid of some scenes. So I thought for some other lines, we'll use the onset audio and digitally clean it up. For example, the actor who portrays Macro and the actor who portrays Caria, they had some strong Italian accents. They are Italian actors, and they were always supposed to be dubbed by some English or American actor. So I thought some parts we would have to redub. But basically, my idea was to rescue as much of the original audio as possible, which was also this all explains why this would have been a very big and tough project to do. And I'm very perfectionist. When I looked at Tinto Brass's edit, for example, the Workprint, my idea was to reconstruct it in color from the negative footage down to the last frame. So if a shot survives in the negative 2 frames short, I'm going to find that shot in the positive and put those frames back there. So I'm really a perfectionist when it comes to that. And I felt that if Tinto is participating, it's his cut anyway. And if Tinto wouldn't want to participate, and if I reconstruct the film, I would do it as faithfully as I can in his spirit, while always being transparent that this is just an informed reconstruction. And it was important to me that the final result in either case should be a film that represents what Tinto Brass was going for in the 70s, as much as it's possible to say. If he had done it himself, now after decades, it would have been his film. If I would have done it, it would have been an informed reconstruction.
Well, it sounds like you would have maybe needed more than just you to do this. What kind of team would you have put together for this?
Yeah, I was actually in conversation with some professional technicians, and that was a wonderful time. And I don't know in how much detail I should go, but basically I felt there were some people who were very knowledgeable about this, who were very on board with this. There was a time, even after Mission Caligula, where I was very optimistic this could be done to a high technical standard.
You even show that a little bit in Mission Caligula. I remember one sequence particularly where you had the black and white footage, and then you do a pushover and you've got the color footage there. So you're showing split screen of new pristine looking footage on one side and then the black and white work print on the other. And I'm just like, wow, if this is a promise of things to come, that's going to be pretty awesome.
That particular shot was the same in Tinto's work print, and in the released cut, when Russ Lloyd did his cut in the 70s, and then Tinto wasn't there anymore, he was dismissed. The people after Russ Lloyd took some shots from Tinto's cut and put them back into the final film. So a few shots I already had in color, but most of it would have been you. I got to say the Russ Lloyd cut, it was an interesting look using a lot of different footage. But I used interesting in a neutral way. I vastly preferred what Tinto Brass did.
You talk about the print that you put together that you reviewed with Tinto, and with that, using still frames, reconstructing things that way, inside of Mission Caligula, you have the sequence of Caligula and Longinus and everybody else at that big party doing the whole thing of Caesar says. Sign of what you were showing to Tinto. Is that what you had reconstructed, the idea of the stills with the subtitles?
Yes, the version that I showed him around 2013 was trying to tighten the editing using alternate footage where I found it, and where the footage was missing, I used stills and subtitles to give an indication of what was to come. It was never supposed to be released that way, and it hasn't been released that way, but this was my idea. And basically, if I talk about it from my own personal experience, it was a huge puzzle and a hugely exciting research project. Just imagine when you look at the still frames, when you suddenly find the footage in motion and you see it for the first time, there are scenes in the film, the way the Tinto intended the film, the Temple of Jupiter in the third act, that are not in the theatrical version, where Caligula jumps into all these coins, which is shot in slow motion in the treasury and so on. And there's one scene which I was able to reconstruct. This was a tough reconstruction. You see it in Mission Caligula on the ship. In the end, there is this orgy scene. Everybody is standing completely still when Caligula walks onto the ship. And he asks, "Are we ready?" or so. And then he shouts action, and everyone starts moving. And to reconstruct that, first I had subtitles. Then I found in the making of documentary, I believe, of Caligula from the 70s, at some point, I believe it was there. My memory is not as clear about this because I've not thought about it in 5 years or so. But in the making of documentary, I believe there was a part where you hear Malcolm McDowell shouting action. And then I realized, wait, it's from this shot. So I put it there. And with a lot of scenes, I couldn't wait to have the negatives digitized and the positives if some negative footage is missing. And shall I explain what negative and positive is to some listeners?
So negative footage is whenever there's killing or rapes or anything, and positive footage is like when they're outdoors and there's sunshine and things, right?
I just imagine if someone assumes that, like, what kind of person I would sound. I want to use the negative footage wherever possible. And so for all film connoisseurs, I apologize. I'm making it brief. But when you shoot a film, it's shot on negative film stock. You know it from photography, where, for example, the darkest part is white, for example, in the footage. And then when you make a copy of that negative, it becomes the positive. So when you have a film print, screened in theaters, it's made from a copy of the negative, which is positive, and you can project that. And the process has an inherent quality loss to it, because a negative has the highest quality. A positive copy has a loss in quality. If you make an internegative from a positive copy, it is even grainier. And when Tinto edited Caligula in the 70s, they did 35mm positive copies of all the footage. You usually don't edit the film with the negative footage initially, because when editing, you cut it apart, it gets dusty, it gets dirty, you put it together, you cut it apart, you work with it. And only when you finalize the edit that's made from positive footage, then in a lab, the negative is edited in a way to conform that under lab conditions so it doesn't get dirty. So the lab is usually the most protected. And in Caligula's case, Tinto edited the film on 35mm positive material. I'm pretty certain about that. Then his workprint was taken apart and a copy was made on 16mm film. That was the copy of his workprint that I found. And I found in the archive a lot of 35mm positive material left over from editing. And then there were parts of the negative, but a lot of the negative obviously is already cut apart to include parts used in the theatrical cut. So the negative of Caligula, I don't know how much survived, large parts survived. But I figured when I edit the film, we'll scan everything. The negative footage has the highest resolution, the best quality. So we're going to use that wherever possible. But if Tinto chose a different shot in his work print that's no longer available in the negative footage, or of which maybe only half survives negative footage, we'll go to the 35mm positive footage. We're going to clean it up and use it, substitute it from there. It would have meant some shots might have been more grainy than others, but I don't think it would have been very noticeable. I felt that a lot of film stock was in much better condition than I had anticipated. To be honest, I was very looking forward to having it all scanned in lab conditions and having a huge database. I was also thinking about all the bonus material. I can tell you a few ideas that were going through my mind at that point, because the archive was exciting. I was suggesting it to Kelly Holland. If I do this project, I might have a blog or a podcast or something where I show weekly discoveries from the archive, maybe parts of the raw footage that are not used in the film, but that are interesting, or paperwork or still photos. There were more than 10,000 still photos in that archive, behind the scenes photos, and so on. Yeah, that was my idea. Use the negative footage, the highest quality wherever possible. I guess there are many proper film restorations done that way, where they source footage from various places and assemble the best possible version that adheres to the artistic intention.
I keep thinking of jigsaw puzzles, especially because this was right before the pandemic. And I keep thinking this would have been Alexander's pandemic project, his major jigsaw puzzle that he's doing throughout that time. When you do a puzzle, you've got the box cover and you know what you're aiming for. And it feels like you were the one that designed the box cover by finding the work print, the first 84 minutes, piecing together all of these other scenes that would have been inside of Tinto's version of it. So it feels like you were aiming at your own box cover in a way.
All I did was reconstructing what I could find out about Tinto's version. And of course, the first half with the discovery of his work print, that was very exciting because that removed all the guesswork, except for the beginning. I think 3 to 5 minutes in the beginning were missing, but I was able to reconstruct something already, and it worked quite well. And the second half of the film, I have an idea of what it was supposed to be like. I also had conversation with Tinto and so on. Though I have to say my vast preference would have been to do something and then go to Tinto. And if he has completely different ideas, we throw what I did out and do what he wants. That was my idea. I was actually very exciting to revisit it with him. My idea was to do all the preparation work. And as I said, I wanted to do a preliminary edit of the entire film that I feel works well, where I would just have taken his first 84 minutes. And then the second half with the footage that I found. Because it's such a huge and technical process, you have to go through all the different versions of the material and so on. So that would have been 10 hours a day or whatever it takes. When that is done, travel to him and casually go over it with him day by day. I can't tell you enough how much I look forward to that opportunity. And so to me, it was always very clear that Tinto Brass has to be involved. He has to be asked. I felt if he decides not to do it, as I said, I would have done a reconstruction that would have been very clear about what it is. But to me, it was important that he should be in.
After you were removed from the project, did anybody ask you for your box cover? Did anybody say, hey, you already have a reconstruction. Can we use this?
Early on, when this other project started, I got contacted and asked if I could just show the work print or my research. Basically, I hadn't taken any physical material from the archive. It was a video copy, a file that I had with the permission of Kelly Holland that I restored. And basically, I was very skeptical what is happening here and why would I hand out the research, what's going on. And I mentioned that this is all stuff that I have done over the years, pretty valuable to me. And I had also never gotten paid for anything. All my Caligula research, I can say I never got paid for anything I did over these years. Everything happened out of idealism. Some people actually reached out to me over the years and asked me if I had made money from this. No, not even Mission Caligula is monetized. It's for free on YouTube. You can just watch it. And so basically, I felt uncomfortable handing out the research, the workprint, without knowing what happens to it. I want to keep Tinto's vision intact. But after my first hesitation, I never got asked again, so no one really tried.
So what ended up being your pandemic project? What happened during 2020, 21, and as you're in the world being shut down, just like I was, just like everybody listening was?
Actually, there was a project. I'm pretty excited it happened. I did a feature film called Fetzenleben, which I shot in Paris in 2019, in late 2019, which was completely improvised. And I felt a little bit as if I'm doing a 1960s film where you just improvise everything on the go. And I came back with so much footage when the first lockdowns hit. I was in Los Angeles for a film premiere in February of 2020. I returned to Germany on March 13 or 14, 2020, right into the lockdown. But I went straight at home and started to edit the film for about a year. I had so much time to edit it, and I'm very happy how that turned out. And to me, that's a silver lining, because if I had done Caligula, I couldn't have done that film. I would have loved to do Caligula, but as I was unable to reconstruct Tinto's version, I just thought, okay, whatever, I'll go to Paris, I'll improvise a film, and I'm extremely proud of it. It's largely improvised. I tried to make it as elegant as possible. And when I came back, I had a huge bunch of footage, and I myself had no idea how to put it together. It was a jigsaw puzzle that developed, and that was my idea when doing it. So the first lockdown, I didn't even notice much because I was sitting at home editing anyway. I remember there was a meme someone sent me, which was so accurate. You saw a guy in a dark room sitting in front of the computer, and it said film editor. Underneath is the same picture, film editor in lockdown.
In the years since we did both Caligula and Mission Caligula episodes of the projection booth, I've been inundated with people sending me updates about this new cut. The ultimate cut is what they're calling it. So much so that I've had to block people because it's just, I can't be as invested in this as other people are. I'm sure you've experienced the same thing.
It's actually one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that we were able to do this interview today, because I get so many messages, and many messages are basically, oh, you have to be so happy. Without you, this wouldn't exist, and so on. And I think a lot of people don't realize, some of them might have the mistaken belief that this new cut reconstructs Tinto Brass's version. Tinto Brass himself distances himself from that version, publicly did so in an article. Then I have those people who say, oh, it doesn't matter if you're not involved. It's great that the film comes out in a new cut. But basically, my aim was always to release a film that adheres to the artistic intentions of the director who was assigned to do it, who spent a lot of time to do it. And basically, that's why I'm also not interested in the new cut myself. I couldn't watch it, I think. I don't want to watch it because to me, it's just another version of the film that yet again does something different than what the director aimed for. And I was always, when I looked at the post-production in the 70s, that's what I can comment on. When Tinto Brass was dismissed, they tried to change the tone. They reordered scenes, they removed scenes, and so on. They edited it in a slower way, so the entire film felt more slow-moving. I wondered why no one had the idea to just go and at least attempt to have the same scene order. We have these scenes that the director shot, put them in the right, correct order. Though I feel that any editor working on that material has to have a very deep knowledge of Tinto's films. I can tell when I looked at the raw footage, to me it's obvious, because when you look at my raw footage, it's also very similar. With video, it doesn't matter how much you film. So very often I just leave a camera running, and you have a very beautiful zoom, and then you have a really awkward zoom, which is just setting it up for a different view and so on. And when you looked at the footage of Caligula, I saw all these incredibly beautiful moments. And then I saw these moments that were obviously never meant to be included, which looked awkward or so on. The camera operator readjusting his lens and so on. And I felt you have to watch Tinto's films thoroughly to get an idea of how he uses that, which shots to use, which not. When I watched his Workprint and when I watched the raw footage, I can tell you that there is a very elegantly filmed motion picture there with Caligula, which just hadn't come out. And I've not watched the new edition. As I said, I don't intend to watch it. But if that doesn't adhere to Tinto Brass's intentions, I think the motion picture that Tinto wanted is still hidden, I think.
I would almost be curious for you to take some of the footage that's been released in this ultimate cut and then go back to your work print again, which I'm sure you have no interest in doing, but there are now more things such as the Caesar Says sequence is there. Maybe not edited in the way that Tinto would have done it, but it is interesting to see some of these things that I've only heard about and that you've shown me via Mission Caligula to be able to say, oh, okay, this is the scene. This is what Alexander was talking about, like with Nerva as far as his suicide. But it is interesting now to finally see a little bit more of what you've brought to light in the past.
There are two sequences that I personally have a high interest in. There is a sequence in the Temple of Jupiter, which was cut entirely from the final theatrical film, where Caligula is supposed to sacrifice a bull, and instead he kills a priest and then talks about Jupiter, and then he's raising fun, where they collect coins and he jumps into those coins. When I reconstructed it, I knew one camera angle of that. I wonder how it's done here.
Unfortunately, it's not done here.
What happened? How is the Temple of Jupiter done then?
I don't remember there being a Temple of Jupiter sequence at all in this new version.
We have Caligula declare himself a god in the Senate. Then it cuts to Caligula and Caesonia speaking, while Caesonia is massaging him, standing on him, and so on. Then we cut to the Temple of Jupiter, where he replaces the statue's heads with his. I think after that, there's a scene where yes, exactly. When he is at Temple of Jupiter, replacing the statue heads with his, he is doing his weird dance at the end of the scene, mocking Longinus. The whole film in the second half gets a more satirical tone, which I felt was brilliantly done by Tinto, because the film is very provocative and somehow also funny in some bits and pieces, and horrible in other bits and pieces, meaning very violent and so on. Caligula does this dance in the temple, and then he's raising money for the war on Britain. And then all these people walk around, throw coins in this box, and Caligula and the little giant, they walk up the stairs and put it in the treasury, and then Caligula jumps into the coins in the treasury. And then we cut to the scene where he's supposed to sacrifice a bull, and instead he kills the priest, and then he goes, Jupiter's treasury is now mine. And then Longinus saying, and you want to raise taxes. There's this entire sequence where he replaces the statue's heads, whereas Longinus talks about taxes that could be increased to fund the war, and Caligula says, if we increase the taxes, the people won't like it, so takes the treasury instead.
Yeah, that last bit with the bull and everything is not there. The replacing of the heads is there now, but not the bull and the gold coins.
Weird. The replacing of the head, from my understanding, was so important. Caligula says he's a god. Everyone goes along with it. He takes the money from the treasury and so on. But with all this kind of more satirical overtones and bits, it's clear that he's not serious about it. He's trying to provoke them. He's now taking the money from the religious cult there and so on. And to me, that was a key sequence. And then this leads to the brothel ship scene, which starts so surreally with everybody standing still and Caligula walks onto it and shouts action. This entire block of scenes to me was so important. It was entirely missing from the theatrical cut, because I believe the editors who were hired by Penthouse after Tinto left in the 70s, they wanted to make the film as serious as possible. And they got rid of everything that could be perceived as satirical and so on. So that was my impression I had back then.
I would say that this new version follows in that more dour tone, that it is not very funny at all. The music is pretty bombastic at times and much more almost like a horror tone at times.
I remember in the released theatrical cut, we have the scene of the structure where Tiberius walks around, this rigid structure with all these people performing various acts, as he calls them, living statues. In the theatrical cut, there is some very gloomy, eerie sounding soundtrack underneath this entire scene. And it starts with this horrible thing where the soldier is forced to drink the wine and he's killed after Tiberius returns and so on. And I realized when I looked at what Tinto had done in his Workprint, you saw shots of musicians with their instrument there. When I reconstructed this Workprint, I realized would have been in contrast to what we see. But so to say, plausible. Tiberius has a structure and his musicians do kind of beat rhythmic Roman music there while we observe all these things. When I watched it with Tinto, we discussed it. There is also one sequence that was very important to me when Caligula arrives in the beginning. The entire scene where Caligula wakes up from his dream, and in the opening, we have the still frame of his face, very blurry, very close up. It's a different take than the theatrical cut. And then he's talking about his dream. The camera slowly moves away. And then he arrives on Capri. We have these slaves working on the rocks, and Caligula gets carried up. And that was a sequence that was missing in the Workprint. It just wasn't there. The pieces for that scene were gone. So I reconstructed that from scratch. I did have quite a lot of digital raw footage for that bit. And I discussed it with Tinto also. Basically, we have what I came up with and what Tinto seemed quite pleased about, though obviously if he would have been involved, he would have gone over it with me again and he would have done it. Basically, Caligula walks down this corridor with Nerva. In the theatrical cut, we hear some screams behind the curtain. But the way that I reconstructed it, you actually see a lot of scenes behind these curtains intercut very briefly. Some of them are very violent looking. Some of them are so over the top that they're just taking you out of the illusion, which is part of what was supposed to be done. And yeah, you have people running around behind there and getting tortured and so on, while Caligula walks up and talks to Nerva. I wonder, how was this done, if I may ask?
Basically, to get to Capri, it's more of a pan across a landscape, and then there's a statue in the foreground, and then it's a dissolve into the hallway where we see Caligula and Nerva coming up. I don't think that you hear the sounds of the screams.
Oh, that was a very... Tinto shot a lot of raw footage there, what happens behind the curtains. And I didn't put it into Mission Caligula largely because I wanted to keep Mission Caligula PG when I released it on YouTube and so. But after we did that episode, you were so excited about Mission Caligula and you asked me when it can be seen that I briefly afterwards put it on Vimeo and YouTube with the permission of the rights holders. And I'm very happy that this is out because I put a lot of moments from Tinto's Workprint in there. So when I pieced back Tinto's Workprint, as I said, it's a black and white 60mm copy that was transferred to video, and I had that video copy. I made a digital copy of that when Kelly Holland was around the company. Then there was also a second Workprint on a very old videotape, which was almost the final cut of the film, but there were some black and white shots, and by comparing the splice marks, I realized that they're actually also from Tinto's Workprint. So I had to piece back the black and white Workprint. And I believe in the Workprint, the first shot from Capri is there, where actually we see the slaves working with the rocks and so on. So that was certainly a shot that Tinto wanted in it. When you think of the Workprint, beginning is there, Caligula waking up and so on. Then when Macro comes in and talks to him, there are gaps. Basically, the Workprint got taken apart after Tinto was dismissed. And I believe it was put back into the raw footage. And they started to do it. And then someone had the idea, let's make a backup copy. So some shots were already put back into the raw footage. So some shots are missing. So we have a few bits and pieces of arriving on Capri and on the corridor. Once you have Tiberius's pool, the work print is largely complete. And it has a very good flow to it. Some bits and pieces might have to be just streamlined a little bit. Someone in some angle moving an arm, and in the other angle, the movement is starting anew. These were things that Tinto would have done when he went over the workprint again. And then when we go to the scene where Proculus is on the machine, on the killing machine, where Macro is killed, it's clear that this was a sequence that Tinto was in the midst of editing when he had to leave, basically, when he was dismissed from the editing, because that sequence was largely unfinished. There were the same action repeated from a few shots. So it was clear that Tinto was in the midst of editing, had already gathered the material, but couldn't finish it. So when I did my reconstruction, I reconstructed that scene as much as possible from the workprint footage of Tinto. And from that scene on, the rest was done by me in a style that I felt works without access to much raw footage, just as a kind of demonstration.
Do you feel that Caligula was mad, or that he was just screwing around with people and just pushing as far as he could just to see how far power can go?
I believe it's actually one of the topics of the film that it's open to interpretation, because he's doing a lot of very horrible acts. You could say no sane person would do it. At the same time, I'm not an expert on any of those mental conditions, if it's psychopathic, sociopathic, or whatever, but I feel in the first half of the film, he gets absorbed in all the power he has, and the horrible rape scene with Proculus and Livia, I feel it's a culmination because he just does it and no one dares to interfere. And I feel the film is not so much about Caligula himself, it's more about the structure of power. And I find it interesting. He walks into the wedding, he rapes both the bride and the groom, and nobody, including them, try to resist or fight back, even though it's obvious that a lot of people are very uncomfortable. And that's just the structure of power. People know he can do this. He is allowed to do this. And as I see the film, until his illness, he might not be insane. He's certainly a very cruel person without empathy. This is my interpretation. I'm not talking about what Tinto wanted. And he gets swept up in this power and all these acts that he can do. And then he realizes how everybody just does everything he does. And I feel the second half is pretty anarchist, pretty provocative. He tries to disassemble this whole system. He tries to get more and more outrageous. There's one scene where he says, I don't know what else I can do to provoke them, and which is very important. It's in the Caesar Says scene.
I think so, yeah.
It says, these are senators. Well, if they're so important, why do they allow me to do all these things? I don't know how to provoke them. And I felt the ending of the film, I've often thought about it. We have this system that we see that's apparently pretty broken because Caligula can do a lot of cruel acts and nobody stops him. And the people who are supposed to act in the interest of the people, act in their own interest, the senators and so on. They just do anything Caligula does to be safe. And instead of changing that system, they get rid of him and appoint Claudius, who in real life apparently was quite different. But in the film, he's portrayed as someone with some mental deficits. And they appoint him to have another figurehead. So the whole system stays. So I had the feeling that Caligula, that's not only a feeling, Tinto himself said it, Caligula is a very political film. I find it narratively quite well done, the film that Tinto wanted to do. Basically, it starts, and we always have hits that are a bit weird. He has this affair with his sister, but in the beginning, he's a scared young man. But again, there is something a little bit off, so to say, narratively. And when you see Tiberius, he tries to behave the best he can, and he's scared. So in the beginning, I would say there is an element of sympathy. Then Minerva commits suicide. You Caligula is curious, but at the end he gets this aggressive fit where he pushes Nerva under, liar, where he shouts liar, which I feel is showing a kind of more cruel side to him. I feel the further we go, the more hints we get. And when Tiberius is supposedly dead and Caligula stands there with the mirror and Tiberius wakes up again, it's an interesting scene. We feel that Caligula wants to strike, but somehow he can't. And when Macro arrives, we get an impression again that he's more a likable guy who can't bring himself to kill Tiberius. And I found it interesting in the first half, a lot of the things he does when he has Macro arrested, even when he has Gemellus arrested, it could be in the framework of that cruel world there, be justified because to him it's kill or be killed in this society that's depicted in the film. Macro had Tiberius killed, maybe Macro will kill Caligula if Caligula doesn't go the way he likes. With Gemellus, in his view, removing a threat to his legitimacy and so on. I'm talking about the film, not about real life. My ethics in real life are different. In the film, it might appear from the character's perspective more justified. Then he does these things like the rape. I feel the rape, that's a real culmination. To me, it's a fever dream of power, and it goes to his head, and he just becomes cruel to people just because he can. I feel the fever in itself is not as important as the sequence where he then walks through the streets of Rome, which is actually one of my favorite scenes, although Tinto never got to edit it. But that scene where he walks through the streets of Rome, for the first time he actually sees the people of Rome. It's his first encounter with the actual people. And the way I interpret it, he realizes that all these senators around him, they don't act in the interest of these people there. It's a separate world. They just like to stay in power. So he does one outrageous thing after the other to provoke them and to shake up this entire structure. And so I talk about mad or not. I think it's a provocative political film. That's what it is. And the main character is serving that provocative political message. Basically, in the end, he does all he can to provoke these senators and so on. She acts mad in front of them, but they don't dare to dispose of him, tell him no or so. Instead, they just have him killed and replaced by someone. They are not brave enough to confront someone. That's something.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news again, possibly, but the sequence when Merva kills himself in the ultimate cut, there is no shot of Caligula pushing him under. So there's an odd sequence where Nerva's in the pool. He has given more of the talk that you've talked about, as far as it's not that sequence that we see in the finished film. It is much more of him calling out Tiberius. But Tiberius does put his hand forward, his fist forward. And I think that what's missing is maybe Nerva kissing the ring, because it looks like he's holding out his fist for Nerva to do that. But you just get a close up of Peter O'Toole's face looking at Malcolm McDowell. And then eventually they stop, takes back his hand. You don't see what happened to his hand. And then they walk off, leaving Nerva in that bloody pool. And then the scene fades out. So there is no more to that.
With the ring, I recall he holds out the hand, and in Tinto's Workprint, it was done in this beautiful pan where you pan across the arm and so on. But I remember that Nerva doesn't kiss the ring there. But then I felt it was a moving moment where Peter O'Toole character, where Tiberius leaves and Caligula stays by himself. I felt there was an incredible sadness in Tiberius in that sequence. I guess one of the major differences in the released theatrical cut versus what Tinto intended was that in the initial scenes where we meet Tiberius with the pool and with this reddish structure, he's supposed to be drunk. And you see him drinking repeatedly, which was de-emphasized in the editing back then. So I feel when Nerva commits suicide, Tiberius is not drunk, he's sober. And we see a much more contemplative side of him. And it moves him that his friend has killed himself. But I find it important afterwards when Caligula gets to Nerva and asks him about ISIS and so on, and when he gets mad. I felt that's a very important moment for the character development. I just wonder why so much is missing. Why is this? I'm partial here, of course. I want Tinto's version to be out, but why is this called the ultimate cut if it doesn't include all the scenes?
That's a very good question. It is almost 3 hours long, and you really feel how long this is.
When I discovered the Workprint, I reconstructed the Workprint, which is the first half. Then I put the second half together from the footage that was available. And that version was around 168 minutes long. So it is shorter, but it includes more scenes, apparently. It has to do with Tinto's editing style, likely, because he intercuts things and they are edited in a very quick way. I would say every listener who listens to this, they should watch Salon Kitty. Not for the content, just for the editing style. And I feel from Salon Kitty, also from Nero su Bianco, another Tinto film, or from Colcore Ingola, if you just disregard the storyline, if you just follow how is it edited, you can see how quickly a lot of things are done and how one scene intercuts to the next. Because honestly, if I didn't know about this, so this cut is longer than the preliminary reconstruction I had, but includes less scenes. It's just interesting, let's put it that way.
So obviously, I know that you don't want to stir up any hornet's nests. You don't want to upset anybody with this. And I know that you've tried to distance yourself from this new ultimate cut just because it is such a heartache for you. But I was curious, if I read any quotes about this project, would you be up for possibly giving me your first impressions as to the validity or possible not validity of these?
It depends on the quote.
All right, sounds good. There has been discussion about who actually discovered the footage. There was one article that says that the producer of this new version is the one that found the treasure trove of material. That doesn't sound like Mission Caligula whatsoever.
This is quite an interesting quote. I would say, to give benefit of the doubt, it's hopefully a misunderstanding. And because the footage was put away in the early 80s, I believe. It was occasionally accessed again, at least in parts, also for the Imperial Edition in 2007. But when I went to see Kelly Holland in 2016 at Penthouse, no one had any idea where this footage was. And as I said, I had to pull some strings to figure out and so on. It was quite adventurous to finally find this archive. And according to Kelly Holland, the footage was about to be destroyed because apparently it was forgotten about and not paid for a long time. That's what she says in Mission Caligula. I don't know the exact quote, but you can watch it in the documentary. So essentially the footage was all there. And they say when this new project happened, the company knew where the footage was because I had told Kelly Holland and so on. It was not a secret. So I wouldn't go so far to say I discovered the footage. I rediscovered it after many years in 2016. Let's put it that way. And back then, it moved me very much when Kelly Holland told me that if I hadn't come in at that time, the footage would have been destroyed likely. And that might make me feel, oh, right place, right time, everything is in a flow. And here's the Workprint. Now we get Tinto involved, and Tinto is still around. He can still do his cuts. And basically the people who are doing this new cut, I hadn't even heard of them until 2 years after discovering the footage.
Yeah, I've been trying my best to find the pedigree. Obviously, you've put in decades of work on this project before you even had the chance to really dive in and complete it. But yeah, I'm just trying to find how the project got put in the hands of someone that I could not find any sort of restoration background or history at all.
I have no ideas, to be honest. This new project appeared out of the blue for me as well. And again, I don't want to go into much detail, but initially I had assumed these are people who are supposed to assist in my restoration or something like that until I found out that basically, yeah, this is what it is.
Now, I had also read that Nathaniel Thompson knew where this footage was and was able to provide that information to Penthouse finally. Is that true?
He was the one I contacted when Penthouse said there is no footage and so on. And he had worked on the Imperial Edition, and I get along with him very well. I remember the first time I went to LA in 2011, I met with him. He was one of the people I really admired for his work on the Imperial Edition. He had very little time back then when doing it, so he couldn't put more together. And so I contacted him and asked, oh, do you know where the footage was and so on? And then he had some memories, and all that led to the rediscovery of the footage, which is why I'm also saying, yeah, I helped to rediscover it so that Penthouse was aware where it was.
We were talking about that Capri scene, and one quote I read about that, because there are some digital effects in this new version as well. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but the producer of this new version was talking about how he replaced or extended backgrounds in this new version. And he said, quote, "It's respectful of the performers and the audiences to take the parts that look like a high school play and make it match the parts of the set that were completed as Donati envisioned. For the transition to Capri, we drew the shoreline as it looked from the real Tiberius's villa. In other scenes, Donati painted elaborate backdrops and would never have just hung a pink curtain to represent the landscape. So we're keeping in line with both the rest of this film, but also the set designs he'd made for other films. I'm a fan of Danilo Donati and wanted the audience to see what he intended for them to see."
This is actually a very puzzling quote to me. When I think of it, Donati did the set design for Fellini's Casanova a little bit prior, and that film has some more abstract scenes in it. I remember a scene where Casanova is on a boat and the sea is made of plastic sheets that are moving. To me, this sounds as if you take Fellini's Casanova and replace the plastic sheets with CGI water of the sea. And the scene with the backdrop, we're really talking about a matter of taste here. Some people would prefer a photorealistic island. Some people prefer a more theatrical staging. The film was shot with the sets the way they are, so I think they should stay the way they are. And if Donati were alive and we could ask him, that might be a different story. But here, I really don't see the point in this. And again, why is it called the ultimate cut if you change the footage? If you remove some... These are not angry questions. It's genuine curiosity. Why do you change things instead of trying to make it the way they were intended to? I'm a historian as well as a filmmaker. I have 2 degrees, a bachelor in audiovisual media and a bachelor of master in history. And with Caligula, I felt I want to preserve what was shot. And I think I know which scene he means with the backdrop with this white cloth, which I felt was a brilliant scene because it shows this morning mood and it looks like a theater, a stage play. I know with the Capri scene in the film Io Caligula in the Italian edition, they put in a shot of the Isle of Capri for the transition. But the way that Tinto would have done it wouldn't have involved any look at the island of Capri. It would have been impressionist. It starts with Caligula being carried up the slope. So to be quite honest, to me personally, doing any digital trickery with the footage, except for cleaning it up, would be a big no-go. Tinto did the film with a certain vision in mind. Basically, what was filmed, Tinto made it work, and the Capri scene works. I just watched a few days ago, just for my reference, the beginning of the Workprint again. And it works well. Macro talks about going to Capri. We cut to Caligula being carried up there. It's very clear where it is. We don't need an establishing shot of the island. And I feel this is the special thing about the film Caligula. A lot of it looks quite artificial, quite stagey. And then there is the scene where he walked through the scenes of Rome, which were filmed in a therme. Therme is the German word. Therme in Rome, in the ruins. And that looks very real again. We suddenly have this dirty surrounding. So I felt in Caligula, he's getting from this more artificial looking surroundings into the real world in that scene suddenly. And it all makes sense.
It's not like the movie was taken away from Tinto during the art direction phase or the set direction phase. It was during the editing phase. So it feels like that would be where you want to concentrate your efforts.
when you think of Tinto's working style, he was great with improvisation, which is why I like his style so much. When you watch Colcore Deadly Sweet, he's just in London capturing things, and a lot of it was just spur of the moment, spontaneous. And with the set design of Caligula, no matter what happened there, or let's say if a set should have been more complete or not, I don't even know about this. I was more concerned with how the film was actually shot. Tinto shot the film the way he felt works. And if something in the set didn't work for whatever reason, Tinto would have got around it. So I feel it must be respected, the film that was shot. And I think if you just put the film together the way it was intended by the director, which is not simple, but if you do this, it starts all making sense and you don't have to add anything in CGI. The idea never occurred to me to add any element.
Yeah, even when you're on Capri and you're in Tiberius's area, there's that shot of the whole proscenium almost, and it does feel very much like a what it is, which is in a very elaborate soundstage.
And basically, that's what I mean. A lot of the film is done also in parts, almost like a theater play with more stylized things. What I find interesting when Caligula is on the balcony of the Imperial Palace, and there are a few scenes where he's on that balcony, the backdrop is clearly painted. Parts of the film actually remind me of a play, of a more experimental play. Other parts are very filmic, and really it all makes sense and it starts to flow if you put it together.
That really checks out, especially when you think of Cesona giving birth basically on stage, and she's the centerpiece of that whole stage production of the birth of Caligula's daughter.
Yes. And I felt, I feel when you watch Fellini's Casanova, you have this very artificial look to many sets. It doesn't look like the real world. And I feel that we would have similar effect in Caligula. A lot of it is more stylized, more abstract. I was always very interested in Brecht's theory about theater and getting some detachment by making things deliberately take you out of the illusion of reality and so on. So when you edit the film the way the director intended to, it becomes quite a complex piece of art that would be discussed very differently.
We were talking a little bit about the death of Merva as well, and the producer of the new version of the Ultimate Cut also said for Caligula to have a story arc, it's important that he not be a murderer until he gets the ring. So talking about Tiberius's ring. Even when he's trying to kill the corrupt Tiberius, he can't do it. If power corrupts, he has to have a first act of someone who doesn't have it in him until the power gets into his blood. Then in the third act, when he loses the only person in the world he trusts, he loses it completely.
That's a matter of interpretation. One might say with Nerva's suicide, suddenly he's alone with Nerva and he gets power over Nerva, who's dying. And he uses that power, he gets angry and pushes him down. I don't see why that moment would be out of line. Also, I think, again, it's not a story arc like that in the film that was intended.
Mm-hmm. And I guess Merva's going to die anyway. So I don't know if it's murder or assisted suicide.
What did you think of the CGI?
It wasn't intrusive. The most intrusive thing was that opening dream sequence that just felt so tonally off. But then, yeah, just there were still things like in my notes last night when I was watching the Ultimate Cut, I was just like, that was a weird fade out. That was a weird cross edit. There were a couple things, and there's one shot in particular where I was like, oh, wow, the quality just degraded significantly. I was able to see some things from Mission Caligula, things that you had talked about, where I was like, okay, this is good to finally see this. And then, yeah, weird things where, yeah, we fade out before we have Caligula talking with Nerva. We've got the treasury scene is missing. So it's just, yeah, it's very weird what he chose to keep and leave out. So the one thing I found very, let's say, disheartening about this is that even the producer of the Ultimate Cut seems to not necessarily take Tinto Brass and his talent and his reputation very seriously. Someone on Facebook posted, if you were to make a movie called Oriana, the Secretary with a Great Ass or something like that, then listen to Tinto, otherwise no. And then the producer responded, okay, that did make me laugh out loud. Excellent point.
To be honest, I find these words quite hard to hear. And I find it sad because I feel that every film restoration has to respect the director's talents, abilities, and style. And to accurately gauge the director's talent, abilities, and style. That's also very important to me. This quote basically is making fun if a film is an erotic film, it's not to be taken seriously or something like that. I think this is about Tinto's reputation as a maker of erotic films. He did a lot of erotic films since the 80s. Tinto's reputation as a filmmaker in the 60s and 70s, he was very highly regarded, his talents. His very first film, Chi lavora è perduto, screened at the Venice Film Festival in 63, I believe. Then Umberto Eco, who is very famous, obviously, people know him, he commissioned Tinto to do 2 short films for La Triennale di Milano called Tempo Libero and Tempo Lavorativo, which were screened in LA in 2012, where Tinto basically tries his hand as a completely new experimental filmic language, which worked very well. When I think of how highly regarded his films were, his film Lurlo screened at the Berlin Film Festival, and Tinto, a few years later, became a member of the jury at the Berlin Film Festival in the early 70s. His film La Vacanza screened at Venice Film Festival in the early 70s, and it received an award. I believe it was a Critics' Prize. So when you see Caligula, at that time, people regarded Tinto as an avant-gardistic filmmaker who has done this provocative film Salon Kitty, and Caligula would have continued this. And it's something for years I try to make people aware of Tinto's filmic career, that there's basically 2 phases, erotic films in the second half of the career and different films in the first half of his career, even though there is a lot of overlap and his style continues and so on. And I feel if you research Tinto and his filmography, you immediately find all these films that even at their time of release were artistically very highly regarded. And I feel that the footage for Caligula that I watched in the Workprint, it would have continued that legacy of Tinto and his often experimental editing that flows. I would say that's something that all of Tinto's films have in common. His early films and also a lot of his late films is just this free-flowing style. When I approach any kind of restoration, I want to approach it with a respect for the artist's intentions and for the artist's talents. And it never once occurred to me to, in quotation marks, improve upon anything of Caligula. That was something I was very aware of. When I'm working on this, Tinto would have had the last word. If he were involved, it would be clear. If he wouldn't have been involved, I would have made a film informed on the Workprint and on his intentions without putting my stamp onto it, so to say. I felt Caligula would have been released the way that Tinto Brass wanted it. It would be seen as a very different film. It would be seen as a huge, provocative, political film, anarchist film. I think it would have been taken much more seriously, artistically, because a lot of the violence in the film and a lot of the unpleasant scenes, they do make sense in the context that Tinto put them in. And this is something that makes me very sad, that this vision appears still unrealized. The silver lining on all this is that I was able to release Mission Caligula, and I remember when I edited that film, and when you and I had our long conversations about Mission Caligula back a few years ago, I want to put as many interesting moments in there as possible for people who like the film, who are really diving deeply into that film. Of course, Mission Caligula stayed PG. I didn't put any of the violent scenes in it or any of that. But if you really study the editing of Caligula, and then if you go through Mission Caligula, you will see in the black and white Workprint some scene transitions and some things that people just speculated about prior. So at least I find in Mission Caligula, you can still see where this project would have been going and what those intentions were, I think. I think the only thing I really want people to know is that Mission Caligula and the idea to do a director's cut of Caligula or to reconstruct one is entirely different from what has come out now.
So how about you? Are you able to put Caligula behind you, or do you even want to put that behind you because you've spent so many years invested in this film?
This is a really good question. Let's say if someone approached me today and said, I want to make it possible to do this cut, we'll try to get Tinto involved and so on, I would be as excited as I was years ago, though I don't know the condition the archive is in. A few years ago, someone sent me a picture of the footage being scanned, which was apparently put up on social media, where you could see a half frame in the beginning being sliced off, a half frame in the end sliced off. And I'm very thorough about getting every frame. But I don't know about the condition of the archive, but I think the excitement could be reawoken, but it would have to be serious because I talked to other people who are very involved in Caligula in various ways, and they all told me there is this up and down. You get a lot of hope up, and then it's stopped. It hope and stopped. Let's say in my daily life, I don't try to think about it too much. I feel this interview is very important to me to get this viewpoint out, and I feel that listeners should also watch Mission Caligula, listen to our prior conversations to get an idea of what the film was, what it was supposed to be like. I tend to not think about it too often. When I think about it, it's, let's say, a tragic work of art that exists in a ruined state to me. When I look at this in a more metaphorical way, like a ruin from an ancient building or so, you can still gauge what the film was supposed to be like, but you don't really see the entire construction. And when you watch the theatrical cut, I don't know the new cut, but I guess this involves any cut that doesn't follow Tinto's intentions, it's basically impossible to see what Tinto was going for because so much footage was shot, so many interesting camera angles. When I looked at the work print, some parts just surprised me when I saw them. I knew they existed, but then I saw them and I was like, okay, this is how he did it. But I guess with Mission Caligula, there is enough out there so people can get an opinion. Though I find it sad that you can't just intuitively watch Caligula, the director's cut, or Caligula, the reconstructed Tinto Brass work print.
I know you are never one to not be busy. What are you working on these days?
I did a documentary, which when I did my film Fetzenleben in Paris, we did a lot of behind-the-scenes footage. And I did a lot of documentaries about old artists. Some of them have since passed away. There was Roger Ball in the Mojave Desert. That film was actually running for the Oscars in 2018. It was in competition. It didn't get to the short list, but it was in competition for short documentary. And I realized I have so much footage of friends of mine who have since passed away and so on. So I decided to do a documentary called Cutting Squares, which is not yet released. It did have its world premiere in LA a few weeks ago, which is an autobiographical look at my filmmaking and at the people I met there. And I got very positive feedback about it. It features a lot of encounter with interesting people, including Helmut Berger's very last time in front of film camera. I did a film with Helmut Berger called Revolution, which stalled for various reasons, but I put a lot of footage into this documentary. So that is getting quite some interest and it makes me very happy.
I think you might have been working on Revolution the last time that we talked.
Exactly. Basically, that film, it started in 2017. I had written the screenplay in 2009, and normally I do my films very quickly. But this film Revolution, there were a few roadblocks happening, scheduling-wise and so on. And they had to recast a role, and then the Caligula thing happened, and basically I put that on ice. It's the only film of mine that I've ever put on ice. Parts of it I did as a film called Gas-Shaped Light about a toxic relationship. Gas-Shaped Light I did shortly after the Caligula project fell apart. It's about a relationship where a man is together with a seemingly nice girl who keeps twisting his words around and making it more and more difficult, which kind of was a darker film than my others. I don't know if I'm going to continue working on Revolution, but now the footage with Helmut Berger is out in the film Cutting Square. So I'm happy about that. And I'm right now actually working to get potentially my PhD in history. I started some family history research. My family is from Bukovina originally. This is a completely different chapter. I started to research my great-grandfather more, and I found so much that I might be able to turn it into a PhD thesis. So I'm working a lot in archives these days. I just combined several weeks over some stays at the Vienna State Archives, finding so many documents about my family history, about who was related to this, and so on. This is very exciting work for me.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm curious if the experience you had around the new cut of Caligula, if that informed gas-shaped light.
Let's say it informed my mood at that time. Let's put it that way. The one thing in Gas-Shaped Light, the lead character is called Alex. When people watch it, this happened to you. I got to say, this was a joke on set that kind of got out of hand, where I was like, how do we name... I love to use improvisation in my films. I thought, how do we name the main actor and the main character? And the actor was joking, let's call him Alex. And I said, that's funny. And then we shot the first season, Alex, and then it stayed. I would say Gas-Shaped Light is a look into my mood those days, but there were different things happening. When I did the film called Fetzenleben the year after, which is also about a relationship breaking apart and being toxic, at least there the lead character doesn't have a name and he looks completely unlike me, which I found nice, so people want to treat it as human as me. Basically, I often put my moods and my thoughts into my films. But I never put it directly. I never make a film that says, this happened to me, now I'm going to show you what happened to me. It's more a general gist, a general mood, some thoughts and so on, and things I observe and all get condensed. You can pretty much see what I'm up to or what my mindset is when you look at my films of each respective time.
Alexander, where's the best place for people to keep up with you and your work?
You can follow my Facebook account or on Instagram, and I have a website. You can just type in my name and you find my website, and when something new happens, I'll just post it.
Alexander, we need to get you back on the show for something else other than painful memories of Caligula. We need to speak more than every 6 years or so, but I look forward to that next time of being able to have a better conversation with you.
Thank you. Me too. It was a pleasure. Even though it was a topic that's unpleasant, it felt very pleasant to talk to you still.
Well, I'm glad you went there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.